This video is on Chapter 23, Section 4 of your United States history book, The Rise of Liberalism. And we're talking about the time of the Roaring Twenties, what went on. We're going to go into radio and film, sports, literature, painting, architecture, prohibition movement during this time, and the shift in philosophies, and on to the rise in Darwinism, evolution here. So yeah, there's a lot of things going on during the Roaring Twenties, and so which is over Harding, onto President Harding, onto President Coolidge, and then we'll get into Hoover, which will come into the Depression. But here, the rise of liberalism. Here's some pictures here. Basically, what was going on in the midst, the Great Gatsby area, and evolution happening, the Jazz Age, and here we have from Christianity all the way down to atheism, as it descends down the spiral of liberal teaching in the midst onto atheism, not believing in miracles, the virgin birth, no deity, no atonement, all these things, and down to that of just being complete atheists, So, and this happened. It happened in Europe, and it started happening in America at this time. The Roaring Twenties lifestyle. So this is a lifestyle. Many Americans tried to forget the problems of the war by engrossing themselves in frivolity. Basically, just saying, okay, let's get out and party. We're going to forget about all this. And so more Americans had free time and money than ever before. There was a chaotic spirit that was spent on entertainment and leisure. And many were swept by materialism. As money came in, they become very materialistic. Religious liberalism and humanism began to undermine the foundation of American ideals. Basically, religious liberalism meaning not taking the Bible literally, right? And humanism focusing on man instead of focusing on God and God's word. And so lifestyles gave up to a lack of morality, and people started doing just what they thought was right instead of what God thinks is right? So, and a lot of this led to problems, and many young women were called flappers back then, and they flouted their parents' teaching and would get out and smoke and drink and use profanity just like men. This is the first time actually in history that it was known for women to do this, before. It was pretty shocking at this time. And onto the divorce rates began to rise, and the American family began to lose its influence in the midst. When this type of thing, from prosperity and the morality is going down, and then all these shocking things comes down, and later on we'll go into complete depression. But radio. So the radio became very popular. KDKA was the first commercial radio station in Pittsburgh in 1920. Soon hundreds of other local stations were operating in every part of the country, and radio became so popular. The National Broadcasting Company, NBC, have you heard of NBC, became the first radio network in 1926. So remember, KDKA, that's the first station, and NBC is the first network. And soon advertising fees were brought in. People started deciding to put in commercials of advertisement on the radio, and it became very profitable to do this. And the families gathered around the radio to hear news. And so news would be brought on the radio, and also to be entertained by stories and by performances on the radio, and even sporting events. They can now have sportcasters that would actually tell what was going on in a sporting events, and baseball being very popular at this time. And then they even had weekly episode series. They'd have like a radio series come on, a talk radio, or I should say a series of story, maybe a storyline in the midst would be developed on, and people would listen to their radio. Instead of television, they listened to their radio. Television was not invented yet. So, but as the movie films came on, it was the beginning of movies before television, right? Some movies, some motion picture movies, and here's the motion picture camera used, grew, and they appeared in small towns, and people wanted to go to the movie, right? In 1915, D.W. Griffith, he lived 1875 to 1948, released The Birth of a Nation, which pioneered modern film. But the thing about The Birth of a Nation, now you go back and look, they actually were criticized for kind of glorifying the KKK. They had some pictures of the KKK in there, so now, they say Birth of a Nation was not the good thing, The films at that time were silent. They didn't have any sound. They only had music occasionally in the background, some captions there, and the actors had to use their body language to tell stories. So they were very flamboyant because that's how they told their stories in silent movies. And so to know what was going on, they had to be very active in their motion picture. In 1927, finally, the Motion Pictures Act added sound. And it wasn't just acting, but in 1927, they'd add sound so they'd be able to hear what they were saying. Here's some silent movies. You see how they had to act everything out in the midst of the silent movies. The Griffiths, The Birth of a Nation there, classics. So, movies. Sports. Of course, baseball became the sport of choice, the sport of spectators wanted to watch. So in 1920 was the golden age of sports, and spectator sports became a lucrative business. And baseball became the most popular drawing of most of the people. So basically, baseball drew the most spectators. In 1919, baseball was tarnished by a gambling scandal. Of course, you have these gamblers come in that people were gambling in baseball. So then it was recovered because baseball put on strict rules that you could not gamble with baseball. And of course, we've had great heroes of baseball at time, but the greatest hero of all during this time was George Herman Ruth Jr. So who is George Herman Ruth Jr.? Lived 1895 to 1948. He was the famous Babe Ruth. And he was the first great home run hitter at this time. He's even considered today as the greatest Major League Baseball player in history, even today, Babe Ruth. So Babe Ruth transformed baseball from low-scoring pitcher's game to a spectacle of thrilling home runs. When he hit a home run, people would cheer him on. So he became a baseball hero. Here's some pictures of Babe Ruth here, batting and sliding into bases. Then we have golf, football, and boxing too. So in the 1920s, we're dominated by Bobby Jones. Here's a picture of him. He lived 1902 to 1971. He was a lawyer. He was a lawyer that went into playing golf, and he was first to win golf's Grand Slam, winning all 4 major tournaments in 1 year. He's the best amateur golfer of all time. So Bobby Jones here with golfing. Harold Edward Grange, Red Grange, 1903 to 1991, became the leading college football player. Before, football was not very popular, but college football became very popular. And he signed then, by signing with the Chicago Bears, he gave the first popularity to professional football. And but college football had always been followed, but now we may be able to watch professional football. So he became one of the first professional football players, Red Grange in football. Boxing. Boxing presented one of the few stars of Jack Dempsey, 1895 to 1983, and he was a heavyweight boxer until he was upset by Gene Tunney in 1898 to 1978. So when he left, wow, he had a long life, my goodness. So anyway, here we have Tunney wins in the midst of Jack Dempsey. I always know about Jack Dempsey when boxing became popular. These are some popular spectator sports now. Swimming and horse racing. In 1926, Gertrude Ederl, and she lived 1905 to 2003 and became the first woman to swim across the English Channel. She also had, prior to that time, won 29 world records. In the first world record, she was only 12 years old. Can you match that? So she was quite a swimming champion, and everyone, now she's known even today for swimming the English Channel. In fact, when she swam the English Channel, she broke all the records of men by 2 hours that had swam the English Channel. So she broke men's records in that. So she was quite a girl, I'll say that. So, and also many gathered to watch the famous man-of-war horse, considered here, and he is now considered one of the greatest racehorses of all time, man-of-war racehorse. So swimming, horse racing, some more spectator sports. In literature, much of the literature of the early 20th century were written by traditional institutions, including the Bible, right? So, but now we came into the Roaring Twenties with this lost generation. And these were a group of expatriates. When we say expatriates, they actually left America. They were not patriots, and they renounced their citizenship. Not a good thing considering, but there was a group of them, lost generation. I'm telling you, a lot of them were involved in Paris in the midst of bars and such in the the drinks, the drinking of that time. They drank a hallucinogen called that had actually THC in it. Basically. Anyway, they were into drugs at that time too. Anyway, so F. Scott Fitzgerald, he wrote the novel The Great Gatsby that became famous, and it portrayed the suffering of vain lifestyles of the Roaring Twenties. So he was putting down the lifestyles. He lived 1896 to 1940. F. Scott Fitzgerald, very important. Here's a picture of him here. So there were others in this lost generation. We think of Ernest Hemingway, another William Faulkner in the midst of this time as for the lost generation of writers. But F. Scott Fitzgerald is one of the most famous because of The Great Gatsby of the Roaring Twenties. And on to modernism that were encouraged rejection of the traditional forms of poetry. T.S. Eliot, right here, here's a picture of him. He lived 1888 to 1965, and he wrote Wasteland, a long poem using the eclectic style expressing hopelessness. So later on, T.S. Eliot wrote some more optimistic things. Actually, he may have become a Christian later on, but at this time, he indeed was a lost generation. So in the midst, here's some more of a lost generation here, books, but just knowing The Great Gatsby as being, and then T.S. Eliot, literature. There were some more optimistic literature during this time. Robert Frost, 1874 to 1963, he portrayed nature and the life in New England in traditional poetry. So Robert Frost was more traditional. He wasn't an expatriate, that's for sure. And also, here's a picture of Robert Frost. Also, the Harlem Renaissance happened at this time. And this was a movement of Black American artists, writers, and musicians. They lived in Harlem, outside of New York City. And this Harlem group developed its own style of art. Art, when you think of art, not only artists and writers, but also in music. So they became some famous jazz-type musicians from the Harlem group. Here's some pictures of what was going on in Harlem at this time. Painting. Painting also drifted towards darker themes at this time and the rejection of traditional styles. The Ashcan group was a group of artists that painted realistic scenes of urban America. And they painted violence and vices and ugliness and some pessimistic works. That's why they call them Ashcan School, right? And then in 1920s, an artist began to reject the realistic forms of modernism and entered into the American art. So American art swayed between realism and modernism for the next few decades. So you said some of the art was very realistic and some of the art was very much more towards the modern type of forms than traditional. So, and you look, some of these look almost like Monet type, you know, in the midst, some more modern type of paintings. Here's some more realistic here of pictures of these young men. Architecture. The architecture entered into more of a modern era more gradually. You know, the America cycled through older styles, and then came in the skyscrapers, but the most popular art was the Art Deco style. Here's a picture of Art Deco. And it originated in Europe, and it was characteristic by extravagance and heroic themes and kind of mythological sculpturings and stuff. So that's Art Deco. On to Frank Lloyd Wright. Here's a picture of him. He lived 1867 to 1959, and he's considered as one of the greatest American architects during this time. He rejected the existing styles and actually created a style that was very uniquely American. Here's a picture of one of his American styles here. See how unique. They didn't have this kind of architecture in Europe. So just think of Frank Lloyd Wright. His work laid the foundations for what would become American architectural modernism. American modernism. So Art Deco on this side, American modernism with Wright. The Jazz Age. So the most popular genre of music of this era was jazz. Jazz was born among Black Americans in New Orleans as a fusion of the style of the former slaves with folk music. So they took the old slaves and basically in the churches, in the midst of their music, you know, bringing their music into the folk music, kind of putting them together into the new jazz. So many critics looked down as jazz as an art at this time until the composers. One of the great composers during this time was George Gershwin. Picture of George Gershwin, 1898 to 1989. He blended together with the jazz with other popular music, and he earning the jazz worldwide popularity. Gershwin brought jazz into being popular. And then we have here Irving Berlin, and he lived 1888 to 1889. These guys lived a long time, huh? He composed many of the songs and was considered the greatest songwriter of this time. So Irving Berlin and George Gershwin in the Jazz Age. Some pictures too there. And then during this time we had Prohibition. When you think of Prohibition, what do you think? They were going to prohibit the use of alcohol and shut down the saloons and bars, right? And they did with the 18th Amendment at this time. Later on, they would repeal this amendment. Of course, we have alcohol today in bars, but at this time, they actually shut down alcohol in the country. It was the federal prohibition of the manufacture, sale, and the transportation of alcoholic beverages. So, and this was under the influence of like some of the leaders of Prohibition, which Sam Jones, Billy Sunday, William Jennings Bryan, a lot of these guys stood up against the effects of alcohol. And alcohol, actually, especially after the war, a lot of even the veterans went into, being drunks, And so the Women's Christian Temperance Union, here's a picture, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. They look pretty like serious. I don't know about that saying, but anyway, the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League would put together against alcohol and to prohibit alcohol. And so after World War I, after the World War led to Prohibition. In 1917, more than half the states at first stood up against alcohol. And then from all the sections of the states, they decided to adopt the Prohibition laws at this time. In 1919, both houses of Congress actually passed the 18th Amendment to the Constitution to prohibit alcohol. In 1919, the 18th Amendment was ratified, And so now all the states, in fact, all the states except for Rhode Island and Connecticut, ratified it. So now they would have to enforce it, which is going to be a problem, right? Because there's a lot of people that did not want the saloons to shut down, that did not want to stop drinking alcohol. So Prohibition, the Volstead Act, and the Bureau of Prohibition. So there were many benefits to Prohibition, of course. Fewer husbands squandered their paychecks for liquor and gambling. And so industry was good now because it eliminated waste as people coming to work, after being drunk, and having inefficiency and accidents in the workplace due to alcohol. So that helped. Also, alcohol produced a lot of alcoholics and disease and deaths due to alcoholism. So those were benefits, of course. The Volstead Act was what they used to put the 18th Amendment into effect. They had to now figure out how were they going to bring in the people that were actually bootlegging and making their moonshine, illegally. So they had to have some way that they could now incorporate those that were going against the law, to police them. So the Bureau of Prohibition, they only had 3,000 agents. That's not much for the whole country. So the Bureau of Prohibition and the Volstead Act both were to put this in effect. And so there was much illegal trafficking of liquor, you can imagine. Moonshiners, homebrew, bootlegging, illegal manufacture of alcohol were all there. So just remember, the Volstead Act was what they were putting forth to incorporate how they were going to control the 18th Amendment, control alcohol. And then on to the Bureau of Prohibition that was established with 3,000 agents. Not a lot to take care of this big area. And of course, then we had organized crime. So speakeasy. What was a speakeasy? That was an illegal saloon that was meeting someplace in secret where people could come and drink, right? And usually they'd have to pay high prices. So in 1929, President Hoover appointed a crime commission. He said, no nation can survive the failure of its citizens to respect and obey the laws which they themselves make. He said, you guys made these laws, and so now you need to stand up against and to obey the laws that you make. So anyway, there's many that would get around, the moral decline would happen and get around the subject of alcohol, and there'd be a lot of crime organized, especially here we have Al Capone's picture and the gangs that were formed in the midst of crime. A lot of it centered on illegal saloons and illegally making the production of alcohol. Okay, let's go ahead. Well, let's go on. We have a little more time. Secular psychology. So let me get something to drink here real quick. My voice is losing my voice. So, man lost his confidence in the existence of a personal God due to liberalism and humanism. And basically, secular psychology would turn to our mind and our behavior. That man wanted to deny the sin nature of man, say, okay, it's not to do with sin, and reduce man to the status of an animal or machine instead. So psychoanalysis and behavioral condition are modern educational system brought in for secular psychology. Here's a picture of Freud, psychoanalysis, and on to the theology of psychology at this time, Christians beware, it says, in secular psychology. Sigmund Freud here, and he lived 1856 to 1939. And whenever you talk about psychoanalysis, you'll hear that in psychology. It denies the human personality and reduces man to a bundle of subconscious drives and fears. saying all that we are depends upon our subconscious nature and what we have in our fears and our drives. A lot of it to do with the sexual drives. And it excuses man's sin by blaming man's behavior on his subconscious mind. My subconscious is making me do this. So this denies man's sin nature. So psychoanalysis means to go back into your subconscious, into your past, and see what's happening to make you behave in these certain ways that are not acceptable in many cases. So here we have a picture of Freud. John B. Watson brought forth behaviorism. So also when you think of Watson, you're going to think of B.F. Skinner, another American, and Ivan Pavlov. They all were behaviorists. Behaviorists were very atheistic. They did not believe in God at all. In fact, John B. Watson's known for the little Albert experiment that he did on a 18-month-old little boy, and bringing I think it was every time they would bring a little bunny, and this cute little bunny, and every time he said the bunny, they'd put loud noises until he was really scared of this bunny, afraid of this bunny. They would not allow that kind of experiment these days on a child. So anyway, John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner both, but John B. Watson says, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. A doctor, a lawyer, an artist, a merchant, a chief, and yes, even a beggar man and a thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, or tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. I can teach him to be whatever I want." No Bible, right? He's saying, I can make a baby, a young person, be whatever. And they took that into the schools, thinking, well, let's teach our children to behave this way. And he says he could teach them to behave anyway. He can make them be good, or he can make them be bad. Behaviorism is a psychological theory that considers a person's environment responsible for his behavior. He's not saying, okay, it's your conscience anymore. It's basically your environment that tells you how to behave. And we can teach you how to behave. So this reduces man to the status of an animal or a machine. And it definitely denies man's sin nature. Economic determinism. So what's economic determinism? Charles A. Beard, 1874 to 1948, began to claim that the economic factors had an overwhelming influence upon men's decision in the course of history. So economic determinism is what our secular books. If you're taking history in the public schools, they don't teach you about God, about Christianity, about morality, that heroes are good because of their goodness or because of their heroic stand for God. No, they're teaching about economic. If you're wealthy, then you're good, right? If the main point was depending on how countries determined a good country if they had a lot of money, and so in fact, when you look back in the history books, they were actually put forth and changed by Rockefeller, the Rockefeller administration, who again, the Rockefeller administration were thought if you have a lot of money, which they did, then you must be positive. That must be positive and a good thing, right? So economic determinant caused much distortion in the writing of history. Heroes of the past were abased. We don't have heroes because they stood for good things, moral things. Heroes were abased. They never really talked much about the heroes at all. Noble deeds were attributed to materialistic motives. Economic determinism means money. money's good, if the economy's doing good, everybody's flourishing, then all is well, is what they would say. Economic determinism. Pragmatism. The end justifies the means. So this is a horrible thing. The philosophy that an idea or an action should be judged solely by its results, regardless of moral or scriptural considerations. William James, 1842 to 1910, did the most to popularize pragmatism. Just think the end justifies the means, a bad deal. You'll get on to a lot of the dictators, including Hitler, including Stalin and everything. And basically, if the end looks pretty good, then you can murder as many people as you want, and it will justify, as long as you get to your means. So William James, pragmatism. The pragmatic philosophy blots out the distinction between right and wrong and embraces the unscriptural concept that since all truth is relatively, the end justifies the means. Another pragmatism, into pragmatism with John Dewey, and he would get into bringing pragmatism into our public school system. And here's Soren Kierkegaard, another into pragmatism in the midst. He's also existentialist. And of course, the core concepts of William James. So really, when you think of pragmatism, you think of William James actually bringing in the midst. Okay, I'm going to stop there. We're going to get into progressive education in the next video.